Episode 10 of The Last Stand begins with Havlock and Sidney confronting each other, leaving Bradford stunned. Bradford still owns a printed version of the Havlock archive, but things have changed dramatically. Out of nowhere, a trained response team repels into an area that Bradford's ghost agents are using as disposable pawns. The problem is that they changed their position. They deliberately lured Bradford into this trap so Havlock and Sidney could destroy Bradford. Sidney agrees to collect the hard copies and upload the entire archive for everyone to see. Elsewhere, Frank and Hutch are running toward the dam, completely unaware that Bradford is already cornered. A gunfight breaks out between Bradford's loyal guards and the newly recruited agents, and the situation quickly descends into chaos. Sidney rushes to the second-floor control room and begins loading, unaware of the gunfire raging below. Bradford becomes confused and flees. Havlock chases Sidney around the facility while he is busy skirmishing. However, before she can reach him, Frank and Hutch storm the scene, and the battle tilts in Havlock's men's favor. Despite this, Bradford successfully disables the power grid to cut off the power and thwart Sidney's attempts to download the data. This leads to a violent confrontation at the dam, where Bradford stabs Sidney and nearly strangles her with a wire. Despite his injuries, Sidney fights desperately and throws himself into the sea, dragging Bradford with him. Hanging from a rope above the deadly waterfall, the two struggle in the air until Sidney kicks Bradford away, sending him plummeting to his death with a final, venomous scream. Sidney almost falls, but is saved in the nick of time when Havlock arrives. Frank soon joins them and notices that Sidney's condition is rapidly deteriorating. While trying to help Sidney, the team encourages Havlock to rise to the challenge and seize the moment. Taking the hint, he escapes into a building. Frank chases him and corners him at gunpoint. Considering the lives lost, Frank insists that they follow the rules and stop it. However, the situation is not so clear. After wrestling with his conscience, Frank realizes the complicated truth behind his actions and reluctantly lets Havlock go. Frank has returned to Sidney and is currently in need of a blood transfusion. Medvac was too far away, and it would take nearly 2 hours to get to Fairbanks, so Frank improvised a dog sled to get through the most difficult terrain. Still, his fate remains uncertain. Frank, who arrives at the clown along the way, forces him to provide transportation and eventually transports Sidney to the hospital. Only then is it revealed that Frank still has a hard copy of the archive. Shortly afterwards, they learned that Mr. Havlock had likely died in a car accident. The body was burned beyond recognition, but a chipped tooth matched Havlock's known injuries. Bradford's body was also found and sent for an autopsy. At the command center, Frank gives Ted the archive and demands that it be turned over to the most trusted agency for further investigation. Sidney finally wakes up. Frank informs him that Havlock is dead, but he himself still has doubts. Caught in the guilt of sacrifice and believing that she has tarnished the legacy of her righteous father, Sidney struggles with the weight of her choices. Frank expresses his regrets to try to make her feel better, but she thinks the government will quietly bury it all. Despite their disagreement, Frank accepts her decision. She convinces him to go back home and face what happens next. Frank returns to his family and resolves to repair the damage caused between them. Luke and Sarah urge Frank not to give up and decide to move forward. Instead, they convinced him to destroy evidence of his involvement. He agreed and threw the gun into the river, trying to leave everything behind. However, the peace does not last long. When Frank called, it was Havlock. The charred body was not his, but that of Julian Steele, a prisoner who disappeared before arriving in Oklahoma. Havlock staged the entire scene unnoticed. Frank agrees to remain silent on the condition that Havlock leaves Alaska alone, but Havlock shows that Alaska remains at the center of everything